All right. In this corner, X.
Yeah.
So listen, we're going to talk about the ethics surrounding AI. And to kind of frame the conversation, I want you to imagine this scene. On the right side of the street, there's an elderly couple walking home. Through the intersection, you see a father pushing his child in a stroller, and there's a brick wall. And coming down that street at around 45 miles per hour is a self-driving car that has to make a decision because of an incident that's making it veer off course. Does it hit the elderly couple, the parent with the child, or the brick wall? Oh, and by the way, there's 3 kids in the car. So this is the type of ethical question as we become more and more embedded in every part of our life, AI and technology. These are the type of things that have to be built into our technologies. So AI ethics deals with looking at the impact of technology on our lives, on our communities, as society at large, as well as the economy. And that's what we're going to try to talk about a little bit today. There's no question that AI is ubiquitous. We're not going backwards. It's here to stay. And we reap a lot of benefits from this technology. The question is, who should have benefit and how it is designed to allow these benefits to be equally distributed? For example, is it to benefit government or the citizens? Is it for a retailer or for the customer? Is it for the judge to make his job easier, or is it for the accused? And lastly, is it for the police or the ones that they're targeting? So although, we get a lot of conversation around the impact of AI, that we're going to have the super intelligence that takes over the world and we're going to be all controlled by machines, I'm not really as worried about that. And we hear about the displacement of jobs, that AI is going to take over all of our jobs. Well, I think it will displace a lot of jobs, but I think for every job that is eliminated, that there will be jobs of the future that we have no idea what they are today. But there are concerns that are right here with us today that we need to be equally as concerned about. And that's what we're going to talk about. So we have an expert here, X, who's going to help us break it down. And the first thing I want to ask, as we heard, X is the product lead for global responsibility at Google. And I want to start, X, by asking you, what does that mean? And why does that job even need to exist?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I do at Google is I lead a product for global responsible AI. So when we think about these challenges that we see in AI, whether it's a model being biased or potentially harming a community, we have to think about how the definition of harm changes across societal context. So what might be considered harmful in the United States is not the same thing that will be considered harmful in India, or the same thing that will be considered harmful in Nigeria, or even Ghana, right, or across Latin America. So a lot of what I do in my research team is we look at some of these challenges that we can tackle, first from a research standpoint. So I work with cross-functionally, probably like 20 researchers. On my team, I work with a core of 5 researchers, and we ask questions. We ask the hard questions. How does harm show up in these systems inside of a place like India? And once we have those insights, then we have to figure out, now how do we address that proactively inside of all of Google's products? And Google's products spread across multiple fields in AI. So when you think about AI, I'm gonna take a step back and make it real easy. AI is teaching machines how to think and act like humans, right? So what does that mean? Well, think humans have 5 senses. Artificial intelligence is split up in pretty much those same 5 domains. So sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste, right? So sight is called computer vision. So that's all the camera stuff, that's the self-driving cars, anything that uses a camera and AI is computer vision. Then teaching machines how to hear is called NLP, or natural language processing. So that's your Siri, that's your voice assistants, that's any kind of like voice-driven AI technology, also the text-based AI technologies. Well, Google has a breadth of products that use both computer vision and also use NLP, everything from YouTube to search to like Maps, Gmail, when you have products like Waymo, right? We just bought Fitbit, so now there's all these considerations across these domains. So really what we look at is, what is the potential impact for harm across these different societal contexts? Now, there's a huge misconception about bias in AI. The way that this conversation has surfaced in mainstream media is mostly around like, it's the data sets. We don't have the right data, we just need to fix the data sets. Now, the problem with that is bias in the data is only one place that it can happen. When you look at the whole process of creating an algorithm, the most popular way you create them now is called machine learning, where basically you give an algorithm a bunch of examples of the thing it's supposed to be able to do, and then it pulls the patterns out, and then it makes decisions, and over time you fine-tune it. The first part of that is putting together a data set to train it, right? So if I'm teaching an AI how to tell the difference between an avocado and a strawberry, I'd give it a whole bunch of pictures of avocados, label it, say these are the avocados, a whole bunch of pictures of a strawberry, tell it these are the strawberries. This is supervised learning, there's other kind, talk about that later. But I'd give it a whole bunch of pictures of avocados and strawberries, and then on its own, it would start to learn the patterns that enable it to tell the difference between the two. Like, oh, avocados are green, strawberries are red. Oh, avocados have a seed on the inside, strawberries have a seed on the outside. And then over time, as you give it more of these labeled examples, it gets better at telling the difference between the two. Like, you might start giving it pictures of avocados and strawberries together in a picture to see, how well it can tell the difference between the two. Now, in the process of putting together an algorithm like that, the part where you put the data set together, you can be biased there. The actual content in the data itself, there can be bias there. Then when you're actually training the model or giving it those examples so it can learn how to tell the difference, there can be bias that happens there. In the way that your model actually ends up being used, right? So whether or not you are using it correctly in a different societal context could end up being biased. And then something people always overlook is the concept that how people feel about the algorithm is also a place where bias could be introduced. And I give this example real quick. If there was facial recognition that was so good it could tell identical twins apart, there'd probably be some people who still feel like that's an unfair use of the technology because they don't want to be surveilled by the government. So bias can happen at any point throughout that process. So our team at Google exists to help Google's products figure out across that whole life cycle where there potentially is bias, identify it, and mitigate it.
Right. Okay, so you mentioned algorithms and bias. So what is algorithmic bias, and how does that come about?
Yeah, so algorithmic bias is a really fancy way of saying that you have a computer system that you've trained to do a task, but the impact of that system, basically you have two things. One, that you can identify within this system that there are repeatable differences in the way that this system performs that are negatively impacting people. So it's not just like, oh, one-off, this thing happened and we can't identify it, we can't fix it. And it also really focuses on the impact of the system, right? So making sure that the system performs well for different groups of people. And this really gets back to performance, right? Like, one of the most famous examples of bias in algorithms is facial recognition. So one of my former colleagues, Tamneet Gebru, did a study of facial recognition systems and proved that they could not recognize black skin unless you literally put on a white mask. That's how bad these systems were that were being used and deployed. And so with that, it wasn't just around, hey, like, we need to make the model better. It's like, this is actively harming people. If this is how, when you go through the airports, when you come back and they like scan your face against your passport, if it doesn't recognize you, that's harming you as a person because now you have a whole different experience of how you can get in. When you have all these news stories around how black men are being falsely arrested by the facial recognition systems, that's where the bias in these algorithms sort of come up. So again, it can happen at any point in the life cycle. It can even happen when you're just framing the problem.
But doesn't that bring back to you mentioned a lot of people talk about data being the problem, but that's the combination of both the algorithm and the data or the lack thereof. So I want you to kind of address that, but also, you know, there's a lot of, we're talking about bias, but let's also bring in more explicitly racial bias when you talk about something like that. So why do we have, and I think we have numerous examples where racial bias, whether it's the photographs or the skin tones or Compass and Snap, which we'll get to later, but how does the data collection or the developers that are impacting this data and the algorithms feed into this?
Okay, I'm gonna take those as two separate questions. So first I'll talk about the data collection, then I'll talk about the developers. So with the data collection, and this is a research project that I just kicked off at Google earlier this year. We just had a launch and a bunch of products. I don't know if any of y'all saw the Pixel announcement, how they're making the camera work better for darker skin tones. So what we found, because at Google in my research team, it was like, how can we make sure that we're testing all these algorithms fairly across skin tones? And what we found was that in all the open source data sets, right? So where people are going and maybe like someone publishes a paper and they put a data set out there that's free for you to use. A lot of startups, a lot of these companies, they use those data sets because then they don't have to go pay to go get data. But in all of the data sets that have facial data, right? So faces, there's like a MIT data set that's come out. None of them have representation of dark-skinned people. So if these are the data sets that we're using to train our models for facial recognition, for self-driving cars, which there was a study that came out that showed that they can't recognize dark-skinned people at night, and the whole basis
So
of
if that elderly couple would have been black, they probably would have been there.
They absolutely would have been hit because it wouldn't have even recognized that a person was there, right? And so if the data sets that we're using don't have us represented in them, the systems inherently will not perform well for us, right? Now there's another challenge there of like how you test data sets for fairness. So the way that people typically tested for skin tone was they adopted this scale from healthcare called the Fitzpatrick scale. And in dermatology and medicine, it's used to like assess risk of like sunburn. But the Fitzpatrick scale hasn't been edited since like 1988. And it's been shown in a bunch of different research that like it doesn't represent black people. So the darkest point on Fitzpatrick is like my color right now. So if I'm testing my algorithm for fairness across the Fitzpatrick scale and black people aren't on it, and I'm saying my model's fair, how fair is it really for the people who aren't even represented in that scale? So in the way that we put together the data sets, making sure that there's representation, also the way that we measure representation in those data sets, there's bias in both of those elements. So my research team, we're investigating a new skin tone scale. Stay tuned. We have some really exciting announcements around an advancement we've made to try to make it easier for everyone to do this kind of testing in a more representative way. So one is the data set is the problem, right? Where how you put it together, making sure it's representative of different people. And this isn't just image data sets. So when you think about like Google Assistant, right? So my mom is Cuban. My mom, when she gets really mad, has an accent. Other than that, she speaks perfect English, but she cusses me out. She gets a little Cuban accent going on. My mom cannot talk to Google Home. It doesn't understand her. My grandmother, who passed away this year, was a black woman from the South, had a very thick Southern accent. I really wanted to give her like a Google Home or something like that to make it easier to call her sister. Never understood her voice. Couldn't understand black names, right? These are examples of where there are gaps in the data set. If you aren't feeding these systems examples of people with accents or examples of people speaking maybe English with different dialects, right? It's not gonna understand them. And so there's an element of, one, how we put these data sets together, two, making sure that they're representative. So to get to your second question, kind of, mind blank.
Developers?
Yeah, about the developers, right? So a lot of people say, well, the problem is we just need more black people building these models, or we need more Latinx people building these models. Yes, absolutely. But at the same time, we also need to be aware of the fact that we don't represent everyone. So I myself, I'm black, I'm Latina, I'm queer as hell, I'm a veteran, I'm differently abled. And even though I check every diversity box to give any company I go work for all those tax write-offs, I don't represent the full spectrum of experience of those communities. So just having me in the room, what we don't want to happen is these companies be like, well, we asked the black person who was in the room, so now we've checked the black box, or we've checked the Latinx box. We don't want that to happen. So what really needs to happen is we need to make sure that these companies are talking to the people who are in the communities that are going to be impacted by these systems. Now, I'll give you a really good example of this. A few years ago, in the DMV, they created an algorithm for fraud detection for the SNAP system, right, which is EBT benefits like food stamps. And what they did is they built an algorithm that was supposed to detect if a vendor, meaning like, hey, I'm a bodega in New York, was doing fraudulent activity on the network. Now, the problem with this algorithm is that it did not take into consideration when they were designing it the way that people in food deserts use their benefits. So meaning if I live next to a bodega, chances are I'm gonna go down there 2 times a day. I might go down 3-4 times a week to go buy stuff, right? And then a lot of these bodega vendors were like, hey, if you're out of money, it's okay. I'll let you take the food and just come back to me on the first, and then I'll charge you on the first, right? Well, the people who designed this system, and there were people of color involved, didn't understand that that's that reality, right? They didn't understand that's how people in food deserts shop, or people in these particular ecosystems shop. So they built an algorithm that was based on an idea that you go to the grocery store once or twice a week, and that you buy a lot at once. And so what they started to do, that algorithm started to flag all of those transactions as fraudulent. And then what it started to do was permanently take away those vendors' ability to receive EBT. And of course, the system isn't transparent. These vendors are getting their ability to receive SNAP benefits taken away. They didn't know that there's all this documentation they're supposed to have to appeal, so they just permanently lose their ability to receive these benefits, right? And that system is still actively being deployed right now. It's still in play. Hasn't been fixed, the process hasn't been made any more transparent. Another example is, believe it or not, in CPS, Child Protective Services. 14 different states use an algorithm that takes an initial case that's submitted and assesses it for risk. Now this algorithm, when it was deployed in Chicago, there was a huge incident maybe 4 or 5 years ago where it literally came out and said one day that there were 300 kids that were 99% to 100% going to die, or like were gonna be severely harmed. Majority of those children, you guessed it, were Black and Latino. 0% of them were at risk of being harmed. This algorithm is still in use in 14 different states, meaning that it is deciding whether or not your children need to be taken out of your home, despite having already been demonstrated that it has a racial bias. Why? Because the signals that it looks for, right, for race, the signals that it looks for to determine whether or not something is at risk are racially informed. And so it's literally, these algorithms are not things that are in the future, they're actively being used. When you have courts using risk assessment algorithms to determine, they call them pretrial risk assessments. So judges don't want to take the time to look over your file, they feed it to these algorithms and it spits out a score of like 0 to 100. It'll say, this person is 68% likely to reoffend. And then that informs how the judge gives you your sentence, or what they give you in that initial trial. Tons of research has shown that that's extremely racially biased. There's a famous case where they took a white gentleman who had already had multiple offenses, had reoffended again, and they gave him like a risk score of like 20%. There was a black person who had a nonviolent offense, first-time offender, and it gave him a risk score of 80%. These types of algorithms are being used right now underneath our noses, and we're not aware, I think, is one part of it, of how big the scope of this problem is. And two, there is no mechanism to enforce that these algorithms are fair. There's nothing to force people to test. There's nothing to regulate and to check that these algorithms are actually working well for our communities. So they're just picking them up, turning them on, and then we get the short end of the stick.
And that brings up, so, some of the examples you gave, I think, were organizations well-funded that are gathering data intentionally and curating this data. A lot of data, we're all walking footprints. We're giving our digital data every second. And, as this technology just continues to evolve, we're going to be all doing that more and more and more. The question, though, is, when in a forum like this, you mentioned the protocols, the policies. A lot of tech companies are acquiring data. They're using data in their companies. VCs are investing in companies that are using data. And so what do you think are the risks, or what should companies and investors be thinking about when we know that there's bias in this data? There's not necessarily been a chain of command over the oversight, and that people are building businesses with this type of technology, with this type of data. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that, then we'll talk a little bit more about other policies globally, et cetera.
Okay. I love that question. I think the first thing that we have to frame this as is all of us in this room, or the majority of us in this room, come from marginalized communities. So looking at it, one, it's the right thing to do, to make sure that the data that you're using in your algorithms is quality, that it's representative, that you take the time to slow down and test, right? To make sure that your algorithm performs well across different entities, right? So I know there's a lot of like healthcare AI startups. Well, how well does your algorithm work for people not just across different skin tones, across different economic conditions, across different geographies, because it's the right thing to do. Now, getting out of that and back to the business sense, because obviously when we frame these challenges as DEI things, they tend to have a short tail, right? It's like whatever's hot right now is what people care about. The reality is this is a scalability challenge, right? And when I say that this is a scalability challenge, a fun fact I like to throw out is that in 10 years, 80% of the world's youth are going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. So if your algorithm does not work well for dark-skinned people, you will not be able to scale your business into that entire market at all. When you look at moving outside of the US, even into regions like India, which are a little bit more developed, India has a huge range of skin tones, right? They also have huge range of economic conditions. So if your algorithm doesn't work well for those communities, not just in America, but beyond, you're literally not going to be able to scale your business to those markets. Another challenge that I really want to emphasize is, you know, when you're looking at this as an investor, or when you're looking at this as a startup, all these big companies, and you know, my company included, have already launched and landed, and now they're having to retroactively go back and fix their models. The engineering cost to go back and rebuild something and retrain a model is not as simple as like, oh, I'm just gonna push an update to my interface. Right now, there is no technology on the market that can allow a human to override a decision and then allow the model to learn from its mistake. So meaning you can manually override the decision, but that doesn't mean the model is going to unlearn its bias. So slowing down and building it intentionally and responsibly from the beginning will save you a lot of money in the future, right? A lot of engineering headcount that you don't have to go back, don't have to pull your model back, don't have to deal with these fairness issues. And I'll give you a good example. There's a software, I think it's called Proctorio. And when COVID hit, all the universities were like, oh crap, everyone has to take their exams from home. So we need a proctor software. So a bunch of big universities adopted this software called Proctorio. They're not a big Google company, they're like a mid-sized startup. Well, Proctorio had a problem where it did not recognize Black and Latinx faces. Literally 50% of Black and Latinx faces were not recognized by this system. So what ended up happening? Universities dropped them like hotcakes. So all those contracts that they had built up to do it, where they were maybe doing smaller contracts of just, you know, folks who were differently abled and not able to come to campus, they lost all that business. Now when you Google them, the first thing that you see is that it doesn't work well for diverse communities. So now you're taking a massive reputational hit that prevents you from a business from scaling forward, right? So as investors, you really want to be thinking about, one, if these people are building these technologies, these AI technologies, and they start to have market traction, what is their plan for responsibility and for fairness? And that can't be something that they're thinking about in the future or not thinking about at all. That's a huge risk to you as an investor, because if they get blasted like Google's got blasted or like Proctorio got blasted, your name is affiliated with that company, right?
Because most of these things are unintentional. No one designed these systems to be biased and be racist or to be unfair. And I think that's the level of accountability and foresight that needs to be put into it in advance, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think the problem is that when we look at this market and we look at capitalism, it's first to market. So everyone is trying to build as fast as possible, be the first to market, get the market traction. It's a highly competitive environment. Well, building AI responsibly requires you to slow down and be intentional, right? And so if you're not willing to make that trade-off, if you're willing to trade a short-term gain for potentially long-term losses, especially with an early-stage company, then that's a risk that you have to be willing to take. A lot of these companies that are out now, we're building, and then they're all getting the brunt of that trade-off through media blasts, right? Like, I'm sure you've all seen the various challenges that Google has faced where different products of ours have not worked well for different communities. And that's caused a huge hit. Google's been called in front of Congress to go testify as to what we're doing to make sure our algorithms don't keep performing in the same way, right? And so now we've stood up an entire department, Responsible AI, led by a black woman, Marion Croak, to make sure that this becomes the default way that we build these algorithms across the board, the way that we test these algorithms moving forward, right? And so I think it's really, really critical that we think about this as a core scalability, core business operations, the same way you think about security, the same way that you think about privacy. If your algorithms, if you don't have enough servers to manage the influx of people who are going to use when you get to a larger scale because you didn't use a serverless architecture, you were being OG and wanted to manage servers in-house, right? That's a scalability problem that you immediately start to mitigate. If your algorithms are not scalable across different user bases, have not been tested for fairness, that is the same scalability challenge, almost worse, if you will, because the risk is bigger than not having the right infrastructure. And this leads into some of the regulations that are kind of...
Let's give us any questions from the audience. If so, come on up. In the meantime, please, come on up. All right.
So thank you for educating us. I work in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, and I really continue to be unnerved about proactive versus reactive. And we see a lot of D&I professionals and organizations that are hired because they're being reactive. So thank you for mentioning the leader at Google who's looking at all of this. And thank you for also sharing that you are queer. So I have 2 daughters that are in the LGBT community. This is kind of like a side question from what you shared today. But are you mentoring in your community? Because I worry about our LGBT community in that they don't know what jobs are available to them. Or they can't see people like you who come on stage all tatted up and bring your unique self to work and how much value you're adding to Google. And I see you in the future. If I'm an investor and I see you at a team, I don't know, like Base 10 Ventures, because they look a lot at AI. They invest in AI startups. You are the expert that I want to see on that team. So what are you doing in your community to mentor individuals like yourself?
Ooh, put me on the spot. Yeah, real quick. So what I do is I'm a firm believer that a big reason why there aren't more people like me in tech is because the language of technology is intellectually inaccessible. When you have 50% of American adults reading at a 6th grade level or below, we can't talk about this work in a way where it's not accessible, where people don't get it. So one thing that I do personally, I create my own trainings and I put them out there for free. I think they mentioned it. I did a whole course on AI where it's really plain language. Like, I've had a bunch of middle school teachers run it in their classrooms. I shot, edited, recorded it myself. That's one element. The second is being intentional about the founders that I connect with. So I mentor a lot with, I see you back there. What's up, Farah? Hey. I mentored her through Digital Undivided, giving, my time in those spaces. As on a personal level, I think it's really difficult for me to mentor individuals one-off, so I like to work with programs, just because the work that I do is so time-consuming. But also, I think the work that I'm doing is on behalf of our community, and as my research around skin tone starts to become public, I make Google, we're making Instagram shorts, we're making TikToks, we're making sure everyday people can know about this work. So I just want to say thanks for your feedback, and also, if any of you VCs, folks, need help understanding how to assess these things or help your startups, I'm always here to help.
Yeah. Where do you find those courses at?
Huh?
What course link again?
Oh, twx.ai, so techwithx.ai, just twx.ai is where the AI course is.
Yeah. So first off, just want to say thank you so much for educating me and probably half the people in this room about things we didn't know. I'm really impressed, so comment first and then question, sorry. I'm very impressed with how knowledgeable and holistic your experience is of your space. It's just incredibly impressive. I want to make sure it's inspiring me to go back in my space and get the data, collect what we're doing for the movement. In terms of my question, You mentioned about the data sets. Sounds like to me that's a big opportunity to be investigated. What are some organizations or some groups that you find kind of inspiring, or maybe they're foot forward with that are maybe tackling or challenging that problem?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think that's probably one of the biggest gaps in this space, right? A lot of what people are doing in the image space when they're trying to get diverse photos is they're going to stock companies, like stock photo companies, but that's not super helpful when you're training big image models because those photos are staged. They're like high quality image camera. Like you need wide array of data sets. I think Angela Benton's company is doing a lot around consumer data that's really inspiring. I can't remember the name of her company off the top of my head. Something else to consider is the EU is coming out now with their own artificial intelligence regulation. And in that, they're requiring that if you're going to deploy a model in the EU, you have to prove that your data was collected within the EU. Otherwise, you can't run your model in that market. So as this regulation starts to come out, understanding where your data came from, tracking that, having it tracked in a way that you'll eventually be able to make open to regulators is going to be really critical to scaling to some of the existing markets. But yeah, Angela Benton's company is probably one y'all should look at for that.
Just to add on to that, you know, we've historically been focused on the digital divide, and I would suggest that the data divide is going to be even much bigger. So, you know, there's data that can help us solve problems in our communities. But right now, to your point, everything around AI is focused on how do we make money? How do we get out there fast, the engineering? But there's been very little about purpose. And there is a business opportunity to collect data in our space. We talked a lot about that prior. And there's also a huge opportunity to use the data that is available for good. And I hope that we can move past a little bit of the profit motive at some point for a little bit more purpose.
Real quick before you go, I'll give you two examples of apps that are really inspiring to me that use AI. One was a research project out of a university in Southern California that stuck a bunch of GoPros on top of cars, right? And they drove down all the hood in LA, and they trained these models to identify potholes and cracks in the road. And then it would automatically report all of that up to the city so that it could be more equitable in the way that they fix streets. So that's solving a huge problem. Another one is an app that Google released called Read Along. And what it is it's a free app where you can open up the app, it works in like 20 languages, you read out loud to it, and then it coaches you on your reading in real time. So as we see these gaps, especially in lower income communities where students fall behind in their reading level, this technology can personalize, help them build up their reading skills. So this technology is not a superhero or a supervillain, it just depends on how we use it and what we choose to make it.
Angela's company is called Streamlytics, too.
Streamlytics, so. There we go.
And she's got a round open for the folks. So, yeah.
All right.
Brian Breaking, Lightship Capital, a big fan, obviously, and an AI practitioner myself. And I can also tell all of us that often when I go to these talks, people give a talk like that, and there's 2 or 3 things that are not exactly right or not exactly true. Every single word you said was true. Every single one. One of the best talks I've heard. And I mean that sincerely. One of the other challenges we have in our space is whenever people that look like you and me speak up, they're attacked, right? Timit's been attacked, you've been attacked, I've been, right? So what do we need to do as a group to support the people that are trying to save us all from these algorithms?
That's a very, very good question. I think one, we need to support getting this conversation out of the D&I space. In the US, diversity and inclusion has been heavily politicized. And so there is inherently a group of people who will not listen the moment you say inclusion or think about diverse groups of people. And unfortunately, a lot of those people tend to be the business decision makers or people with a lot of money. So the more that we can collectively reframe this as a fundamental business problem, this is a scalability challenge, this is going to block you with the AI regulation coming out in the EU, this is something that's going to prevent you if you don't have fairness testing for your model. They have this thing called sensitive domains. So anything in healthcare, anything in finance is going to be required to be demonstrated to the government that you've tested your model for fairness and how fair it is. So if you want to be able to run your models in the EU, you have to have that, right? So if we can get out of this conversation that has been so heavily politicized inside of the United States and move it into a larger conversation, I think that's one way we can support, because then it gives us a bigger platform to actually drive people to care. The second thing is those who've been negatively impacted, like Timneet, give them jobs. You know what I mean? Like, Timneet spearheaded the entire field of ethical AI with her initial research that she did with Joy Buluamini. She created what's it called now? The FACT conference, Fairness and Accountability in Machine Learning conference, and just got dogged out, in my personal opinion. This isn't me speaking on behalf of Google, but like got dogged out in the way that they let her go. And like, those people need platforms. They need to be lifted up. If you have an AI startup that needs to look at fairness, she's out there. Hit her up on Twitter. Hire her to come and help your company think about fairness across these different dimensions. Have her get equity in your startups, right? Like, this is the way that we can support each other. It's a phrase that we say in Santeria. It's like the right hand washes and then the left hand clears. It's like you need both hands to be able to clean yourself, right? So if us as a community want to avoid these pitfalls, we have to support those in the space that are doing the work.
Thank you. Last question, Tosh.
Hey, Tosh Ernest, Head of Wealth for Advancing Black Pathways, JP Morgan Chase. You shouted out Laura Milligan. I'm going to do the same thing. Digital Undivided. We're starting a series of boot camps with them with a $5,000 grant. Applications end on Monday. If you know any LA-based Black entrepreneurs, please have them apply.
I know tons.
Oh, awesome.
I'm
Have them
LA
apply,
based.
and we'll be doing quarterly roadshows with Digital Undivided right the way through next year for female-based Black entrepreneurs along with the grant. So please, just have them get in contact with Digital Undivided and do that. But my question is, given COVID and the way that large banks lend, our risk models have really changed over the last year because they take into account things like revenues and cost bases and all this stuff that just needs to change. And I really think it's a chance for us to start again, because we know that the way that the underwriting machines would underwrite would mean that Hakeem and Harlem wouldn't get a loan, but Harold and Gramercy would. And I would just love some of your thoughts around that. Like, how do we start again? I think that in a perverse way, COVID has allowed us to rewrite the rules around how we lend and do small dollar lending, maybe even digitize it, so that we can get out these smaller dollar loans to really deserving entrepreneurs of color. So just looking for your thoughts. Thank you.
I think the first thing is we really need to take into consideration the reality of the way COVID has impacted certain communities. At the peak of COVID, over 50% of Black American adults were unemployed. So if we're looking and using old models where we already were disproportionately not employed to then decide who gets money moving forward, that inherently is biased. And the thing about AI is it can only learn from the past to predict the future, right? So even in the way that lending was done, there's a famous case study of how AI failed in the lending space because they took a bunch of historical loan data, and then the AI was like, oh, well, women can't ever have a house. Because societally speaking, women didn't start to apply for loans until the late 80s, early 90s. So if you're taking 50 to 100 years of data and using that to predict who should get it next, that's what you call a latent bias, where it's picking up the historical societal context and trying to apply that to the future. So one, we need to think about, what are those realities for those communities who've been impacted from COVID, right? When you have all these small businesses who weren't deemed essential and then were shut down and lost their businesses, right? Like I was invested in a couple of cafes owned by Latinx people up in the Bay Area that all shut down because they weren't deemed essential and weren't allowed to stay open. So what is the model that we need to think about? What are the other elements that we can pick up on from these folks to decide whether or not they will be successful in business moving forward without evaluating them solely on their past? Because given the way COVID has disproportionately affected certain communities, that is literally going to be making something that's biased against them, right? So I think it starts with acknowledging that there is a disproportionate impact with those communities. Two, looking for additional factors or other factors that can be used. Like, for example, were you accepted into the Digital Undivided Accelerator? Right? Maybe you can take into like the output or feedback from the accelerator to decide if their business is going to be successful. And this is just me brainstorming off the top of my head, but not judging people based on one credit scores, because we all know how that stuff gets jacked up, not basing people based on what revenue they've made previously, but finding new and innovative ways to support them and also bringing together resources to ensure they're successful. So when you go through something like Y Combinator, they give you free cloud credits, they give you mentors, they give you all that type of stuff. So maybe if JP Morgan Chase has a small business lending program, they could like pair you up with those types of resources.
Great. Thank you all, and I want to thank Andrea for being such a visionary to allow us to put this subject on the back end of this wonderful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you
both.
for having us.
Thank you, X, for coming all the way in from California for this, and James for pushing the envelope to make sure we had this content.